Welcome, everyone. We are now in a position to start our second panel. We have now a much bigger panel because we have important and a diverse set of questions to discuss related to, again, opportunities and barriers to the deployment of renewable microgrids. We'll keep the focus on technologies that are either ready to be deployed or that have the prospect of being available within the next foreseeable future. I will start from the extreme right for you with Amgad Elgowainy from Argonne National Lab, where he's a team leader and the principal energy systems analyst in the energy systems division. He has also been involved for a number of years as one of the lead developers in the DOE's initiative for hydrogen. As you know, DOE has been investing on producing hydrogen from intermittent sources, and I hope he'll be able to elaborate on that as we go. Next, we have Mark Hersam, here from Northwestern University. He's the director of the Materials Research Center here, and also a Murphy professor in the Materials Science Department. Mark is an expert in a number of things, including lithium-ion batteries, and he will be commenting on that. Then we have another colleague here from Northwestern, Sossina Haile. She's also a professor in the same department, and also a professor in applied physics. And she brings in, I would say, a brand new type of technology for the current times that relates to the possibility of creating commercializable, reversible electrochemical cells. And then finally, we have Jorge Elizondo. He is a lead engineer and also a co-founder of an MIT startup in California, which called Heila Technologies, which really provides technologies for development of small, intelligent microgrids. So I guess we could start in this order and have you, Amgad, having some of your opening remarks, and then we'll follow with questions.
Okay, thank you, Adilson, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Amgad Elgowainy from Argonne National Lab. A few months ago, I met with Eric, and we discussed the possibility of hydrogen and synergies between hydrogen and the renewable grid. So today, I will introduce to you Hydrogen at Scale, which is a U.S. Department of Energy initiative. That initiative actually was led by a multinational lab, initially conceived by Richard Boardman at Idaho National Lab, and then after that transferred the leadership to Brian Pivovar from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Argonne is a co-lead on the analysis team, and I will give you some introduction about how hydrogen at scale, how hydrogen could be used for energy storage and beyond, and the synergy between hydrogen and the renewable grid. So if you look here, hydrogen is at the center of the power sector, the transportation, the industrial sector, and as the states push for high renewables on the grid, mainly solar and wind. So at times when you have production and less demand, then these electrons can go through storage, or they can go to produce hydrogen and put it in the form of chemical storage. In this form is a hydrogen molecule. Alternatively, when nuclear fleet is kind of squeezed by the low-cost natural gas or the renewables, and you want some utilization of that power, there is some value proposition there to do high-temperature electrolysis also to produce hydrogen, which can go into storage. The idea here is that there is synergy between the hydrogen that is produced from renewables or low-carbon sources and several applications. In the near term, there is what is called the power to gas, where hydrogen can simply be injected in natural gas pipelines, basically to green the natural gas pipeline. Hydrogen has been a focus for fuel cell vehicles, and the one value proposition there is that always your cost per BTU of the fuel is at the highest, even compared to the cost of electricity, although electricity is a higher form of energy, but you will see comparable cost for a unit of energy when it is used as a fuel. And therefore, hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles is an early market application, especially in California, where you have synergies between the high renewable standards and also the zero emission vehicle mandate, which promote electrification, both battery and hydrogen. And then there are other applications where you could use hydrogen with CO2 to produce renewable hydrocarbon fuels, upgrade bio-oils or refinery oils, produce ammonia, which is a major source for a major consumer for hydrogen, and so on and so forth. The key here is that hydrogen could be an energy storage. It could be a sink for the electrons, especially when the electrons are not needed and therefore are low cost. The idea here is that hydrogen storage, to give you a feel, you could store a kilogram of hydrogen between $600 to $1,000. So a kilogram has 33 kilowatt hours. So on a per kilowatt hour basis, you can have like $20 to $30. And you can compare that to battery, which is an order of magnitude higher. Of course, the drawback is that you have an additional cost here, which is kind of an overhead in your electrolyzer and also compression. So this will make sense only if you have a large scale storage so that your overhead is small. And therefore, really, we see the value for hydrogen when you are able to bring the cost of electrolyzer down and to have your overhead cost to be very small. And here we show the path for reducing the cost of electrolyzer from today, where you have $400 per kilowatt, the power of electrolyzer, and we want to compete with natural gas hydrogen. Here you will see the cost of electricity is a big factor. If we move to renewables, you will see that the cost could shrink, but the capital portion will grow because of a low utilization factor. And if we put the R&D where the cost per kilowatt goes smaller, similar to the research funded by DOE to bring the cost of fuel cells, electrolyzer is just the reverse of fuel cell, then we could realize a low-cost hydrogen storage. So with that, I will leave you with that slide. This shows the different energy storage forms, including batteries. You will see hydrogen will make more sense at the hours to days, even to months, long-term storage at different power levels.
Wonderful. I would like to keep that slide as we go through. So we can go now with you, Mark.
Sure. So again, my name is Mark Hersam. I'm a professor of material science and engineering here at Northwestern. Our laboratory works at the interface between electronic materials and chemistry. We work at this interface for two reasons. One is being trained as an electrical engineer. I know that electrical engineers get very little chemistry training. And I would say most chemistry curricula have very little electronics training. So we decided to work at an interface where there's very little activity because very few groups can span both of those disparate disciplines. So that's sort of a strategic reason to work at that interface. From a scientific perspective, if you look in the electronics industry over the past 5 decades, the business model has been to make the fundamental circuit element, the transistor, smaller and smaller, which means that the surface area to volume ratio has been increasing with time, and therefore control of surface chemistry has increasing importance in that technology. And we do that in the context of minimizing power consumption in electronics, which I think is relevant to a discussion about energy. But what we've learned over those years is that the same approach applies to many other technologies in the context of today's discussion. That would be battery technology. Specifically, if we think about lithium-ion batteries, a somewhat ubiquitous technology, probably everyone in this room has a lithium-ion battery on them in their computer or their smartphone. This is a device where the interior of the battery is operating outside of thermodynamic equilibrium. By that I mean at the electrolyte-electrode interface, chemistry is constantly happening. And the knowledge we learned from controlling chemistry and electronics can now be applied to the lithium-ion battery problem. And allows us to address issues such as safety. I think it's well known that lithium-ion batteries, because they are out of equilibrium, are on the verge of explosion at almost any time. And so managing that is, of course, quite important, especially if we go to much larger systems, as you might have in a microgrid environment. We worry about traditional metrics in batteries, such as how much energy can be stored per unit volume or per unit mass. Also issues of the rate at which you can charge and discharge batteries, which I think also in the context of microgrids is critical, in that a lot of the energy you want to store is coming from fluctuating sources such as renewables, so being quick to respond makes battery technology more viable in that context. So this is what I'm hoping to discuss some more in the panel today, and I'll be happy to take more questions later.
Thank you, Mark. Sossina, as you introduce yourself, I'll ask you to both comment about your home country of Ethiopia, where you have an interesting example to share with us about distributed generation, and also answer the question of what is a reversible electrochemical cell.
Okay. So yes, I'm Sossina Heila, also in material science and engineering, along with Mark. As just introduced, I am also originally from Ethiopia, so that perhaps gives me a little bit of a unique perspective, unique take on this. But let me say a little bit of my research area. It's very much in the area of understanding the interplay between chemistry and electrical energy. So very much been in the area of electrochemical energy conversion. And 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of excitement about fuel cells and about a hydrogen economy. Some of the challenges, of course, with hydrogen distribution came to be recognized, and in 2008 or so, there was a shift as we recognize very much from an emphasis on hydrogen as a way to store energy to batteries. And that meant that, in fact, in many cases, people doing fuel cell research were trying to think about how they could continue to contribute. In some cases, some groups went over into the battery field because a lot of the fundamental topics are very similar. On the other hand, what has also happened in the last 15, 20 years, as we've seen here, is that the cost of renewables, cost of solar in particular, but wind as well, has really come down. And so 15, 20 years ago, when people talked about making hydrogen, it was very much in the context of doing methane reforming, and nobody really wanted to do that because that's not really decreasing CO2 emissions. In the current era, as we heard a little bit, that the fact that there are these intermittent sources available on the grid means that the idea of electrolysis becomes much, much more interesting now, because there are times when we have this excess electricity, which is in fact a problem for the grid. And if we can do electrolysis in a microgrid kind of scenario where our electrolyzer, we can in fact run it in forward and reverse as a reversible electrochemical cell. So sometimes it's operating as a fuel cell, and sometimes it's operating, a fuel cell would be taking hydrogen and giving you electricity, and then sometimes operating in the reverse, which is to take in the electricity and create hydrogen as storage. It becomes basically another form of a battery. And so we don't have to worry so much about a large grid. We don't have to worry about the size of the storage. It can be a remote, small location as long as that electrochemical cell works very well. And so in my laboratory, we've been trying to address this point, having taken many of our fuel cells that have been very effective and seeing what it takes to run them in reverse as electrolyzers and then allow them to go back and forth so that they can do the storage. Now, let me just comment a little bit on my home country of Ethiopia. It's a population of more than 100 million people, so that makes it the second largest country in Africa by population after Nigeria. It's had incredible economic growth in the last 10 years, 10% a year, which makes it the third largest, highest economic growth after China and Myanmar. The regional average was around 5.5% over that 10-year time frame, but starting from a very low base, so the per capita income is still only $700 a year. So let me talk about the energy use in Ethiopia. It is 92% biomass back in 2012 or so, and it's essentially all in the use of cooking. There's only about 1% or so electricity use in terms of the consumed electricity, and remarkably 99% of that is hydro. So the country has about 2 megawatts installed hydro power with the intent within the next few years to build new dams. These are almost operational now. It'll be at 10, not megawatts, sorry, gigawatts. So 2 gigawatts of existing power, and another 8 will be added in the next couple of years. And maybe some of you have heard about negotiations with Sudan and Egypt, because putting a big dam on the Nile is very troublesome for Egypt. So Egypt is a little distracted with other things, so this is an opportunity for Ethiopia to quick put in that dam while they're not paying attention. The amount of hydropower that's already used is little under 5% compared to the capacity. So this is a really interesting time, but it's also a country that the grid is horrible, having been there very recently as well. And also, it's when we have so much climate change, it's also a challenge because you run into drought. And Tanzania, for example, also has a lot of hydropower. And when I was there, they were all saying, you know, we just haven't had power because this year was a lot of drought. So very risky. And so having more of a distributed scenario is something that is, you know, very helpful from a development perspective, that you're not relying entirely on one source. So that's a little bit of context there.
Thank you. As we go to you, Jorge, you'll be the guy who puts together all the assets here in the microgrid. I'd like to ask you already up front, from a control management perspective, what is, as you introduce yourself, you can answer, what is the main challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll first talk a little bit about my background. So my name is Jorge Elizondo. I started working on microgrids and distributed energy resources a long time ago, first building small microgrids or small off-grid systems in Mexico, where I grew up. And then in 2011, I went to MIT to do a PhD in microgrid control and analysis. And I got a lot of theoretical understanding of these systems. And then in 2015, while I was in the PhD, still 1 year to go, I received an email from this project in California called the Stone Farm Microgrid, which you will hear more about during lunch, asking who wanted to do an internship and actually help in building a real microgrid. So I responded. I was invited to join there. I was there for a month and a half. And when I went there, I noticed by working in the field and trying to apply what I learned in the classroom and apply in the real world, that microgrids are very complicated and very difficult to build. And the difficulty lies in the customization. And that's exactly what it was being discussed in the last panel. So you go to a project, you have to start from scratch. And that's just very hard to do. And the customization comes because of 3 main problems as I see it. The first one is that the ecosystem is very non-standardized. So you have a lot of different vendors, a lot of different pieces. And you have batteries, you have fuel cells, you have a lot of different technologies that you have to integrate. So that's not easy. And then microgrids are also very complicated because all this equipment has different response times, different efficiencies, different characteristics with temperature. So it's a very complicated system. Not only is not standardized, it's also complicated. And then most of the approaches to microgrids is to do a very rigid design. So you hire a company to build to design a microgrid, and then they give it to you, you pay a lot of money for it, and then you build it, and then next year you have more money, you want to add something new, and they want to build you again to design the entire thing because microgrids are not built for modularity. So in Stone, that's what I discovered while I was in the internship. And so I say, well, I think the solution will be to take a building block approach, and that's where my company started, Heila Technologies. What we did was to create a building block creator for microgrids. And the idea of these building block creators is to be able to help in adding and removing assets from a microgrid very easily so that you don't have to redesign the control system. And that helps a lot in the modularity. So you don't have to, you can grow your microgrid over time. You don't have to pay everything from scratch. And that can really, simplify the construction of microgrids. You also have to, and the only way to do this is to distribute intelligence. So you also have to do that, meaning that every asset has to be more intelligent so it can come into the microgrid or leave the microgrid seamlessly. And by distributing intelligence, you can encapsulate the complexity of all these great technologies that are being developed. You don't have to show all the complexity to the microgrid controller and say, hey, control it now, which is just very complicated. So you can encapsulate the complexity in smaller units, in smaller building blocks. And I think the best analogy for this is an orchestra. So in an orchestra, you can think that you have a conductor that sends signals to every single performer in the orchestra, but that signal is very simple. That the performers have to have intelligence of their own. So I noticed that there was a lot of work being done in the conductor, like the central controller for microgrids, and you have the Siemens and the Schneiders working very hard on that. And then there's a lot of work in building very good instruments, like the inverters and the batteries and the fuel cells and all these technologies. But there was this gap in putting intelligence into the performers of the orchestra, and that's where my company started working. And we were fortunate to win the MIT Clean Energy Prize, the first prize of the MIT Clean Energy Prize, and then the DOE Clean Tech Prize with this idea. So we have implemented a lot of these things in the Stoner's Farm microgrid that is in Sonoma, California, which has been our testing site. That's not only a functional microgrid, as was mentioned in the morning. It kept the lights on during the fires, but we're also moving it towards a place where we're actually demonstrating how it is scalable and how it is modular by adding a lot of new controllable devices and a lot of different technologies. So, yeah, that's my introduction.
So if I get it right, the main challenge is the lack
customization.
of standardization.
It's the customization of each system that you have to.
And your response to that is to go modular.
To go modular, to go building blocks, right? So you solve one piece and then you integrate it into the microgrid. You solve the next piece, you integrate. Instead of having to solve the entire microgrid, and then you go to the next system and it's a new microgrid, so you have to solve it again. So if you solve smaller blocks, then you can put them together into different shapes, right?
I want to come back to you on how do you do the management of information, data processing in that case. But first, let's revisit the issue of storage. We have here three different forms of storage, and I have the impression that a microgrid could rely on more than one of them. Hydrogen tends to be more for long-term storage, batteries for short-term, and so on. And each of you alluded to different constraints, and I would like you to comment on that. Some cases seems to be more manufacturing, some cases more fundamental material science. And starting with you, Amgad, you mentioned that in the case of hydrogen production, now at least at small scale, which would be the case of many microgrids, the cost of the electrolyzer is the main issue. And in the case, closely related example of costs going down is the case of fuel cells that over the years has gone down significantly. What would have to be done for the electrolyzer cost to go down the same way?
So electrolyzers, as my fellow speaker here mentioned, it is the reverse of a fuel cell. Yet there was little R&D done on the electrolyzer, and the main focus was on fuel cells, mainly for vehicles, because vehicles employ fuel cells. So the major cost item in the electrolyzer is the stack, actually the membrane, the electrodes, and the second biggest item is the balance of plant. So half of it roughly is on the stacks, and then quarter of it is roughly in the balance of plant, and then the balance are others. So if you focus on the stack itself and then the balance of plant, like what has been done for fuel cells, and to find the right catalyst, the low-cost catalyst, and to improve the membrane durability, all of these are cost reduction factors. And the success Department of Energy has seen through funding over since 2002 through 2012 I mean, you have seen a cost reduction from roughly $300 per kilowatt down to roughly $50 or $60 a kilowatt, which is a significant reduction. So we believe that further R&D invested in the electrolyzers could bring a significant cost reduction as well.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could have your word now, Mark, about the battery scenario. You implied that materials is the way to go, and perhaps it would be nice to have some examples of material innovation, particularly in the case of lithium-ion battery, which seems to be the best bet in that area, that has really transformed and led to better metrics.
Yeah, so as I alluded to in the introductory comments, the key issue in lithium-ion battery is the interface between the electrodes and the electrolyte. The electrolyte is typically a liquid. The electrodes are solids. And you're operating that electrolyte outside of thermodynamic equilibrium, outside of its stability window. And as a result, chemistry will occur at the electrode surface. And that chemistry tends to lead to decomposition of the electrolyte. This will be hindering lithium-ion transport, and this is why if you have an iPhone and you use it for a year or so, you find that the capacity of the battery is dropped as a function of time. That same interface also will limit the rate at which you can lithiate or delithiate the battery. It also has implications for the operating temperature range of the battery. If you happen to have a Tesla and you live in Chicago, you know that you have less range in the winter than you do in the summer because the battery doesn't operate as long. Or if you have an iPhone and you go skiing, the phone may stop working on the ski lift because it doesn't operate at low temperatures. So if we can manage that interface better, we could address all of those issues concurrently. And so what we do in our lab is to use a relatively new material called graphene. Graphene is a one-atom thick sheet of carbon derived from graphite, which is a relatively abundant and cheap raw material. And we figured out how to take that graphene and code it onto the individual particles that make up the electrodes in lithium-ion batteries. That controls this interface with the electrolyte, gives us longer lifetime, and importantly implies that we can increase the surface area of the electrode. And we do that by making the individual particles in the electrode smaller and smaller. When you make it smaller, the distance over which lithium has to travel decreases, and therefore the speed increases. You can charge these batteries in minutes as opposed to hours, which has obvious practical implications for any lithium-ion battery technology, but particularly in the grid or microgrid environment with fluctuating sources of energy that need to be stored, this rapid response time is very meaningful. That's on the charging side. On the discharging side, it implies that you get more power or more acceleration in the discharging. And as a result, for electric vehicles, the possibilities become much broader. The trend, which I think is known to many in the news, is to go from cars to trucks and beyond, perhaps even to trains or airplanes. And this is going to require more power on the discharge side. In fact, a lot of the interest in our technology is for drones, for the liftoff of the drone, and the fact that drones go into relatively high altitudes where the temperatures drop. And the temperature issue I talked about before is also mitigated by the speed of the battery. When you cool things down, they tend to slow down. But if you're already plenty fast, you can afford that slowdown without compromising performance completely. So this is where we're operating. The nice thing about our technology is that it's a platform technology. It works on both the anode and the cathode, both sides of the battery. It works with the variety of materials that are being explored for both sides of the battery. And that implies that we can begin to explore different materials for different applications. And the last comment that I'll make is that in talking to companies like Tesla or A123 who are in the battery space, one recent issue in the news has been the fact that most batteries today use cobalt in the cathode side. And cobalt was in the news because of the fact that it's mined in the Congo by child labor. And a lot of companies want to get free of cobalt In our lab, we're working with materials like lithium manganese oxide, for which there's no cobalt. The graphene approach that we're using make those materials much more competitive in the battery context.
Excellent. I want to follow up with a question perhaps to most of you about, we are thinking here about storage mostly in the context of the microgrid, but it's clear that the electrical grid will be increasingly more coupled to the transportation system in the future. And the way we will power the cars will matter then. Right now, there is this perception, at least here in the US, that maybe electricity will be the winner there, and we will be driving electrical cars in the future, all of us. But there are alternatives, and hydrogen is, of course, the most obvious one. And I would like to have the opinions of at least some of you on the prospects of that, particularly with the idea that you might have a reversible cell that could, in principle, operate almost like a rechargeable battery.
So I have to confess that I've always been skeptical of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles because the storage challenges are quite daunting. And it's not to say that they couldn't and shouldn't happen, but that is a really difficult step. And so, in fact, in the context of a microgrid or distributed power, I've always viewed that would be the easier place to put fuel cells in, and because they could operate on natural gas as a bridge technology, in fact, and as well, as I said, now when we use them in a reversible way, they are also able to provide long-term storage. So if you're in Germany, for example, where there's actually quite a bit of solar installed, but you have seasonal variation, then you can store for long periods of time without loss of discharge. So we know that batteries have lots of places where they're very useful, but one where they face a challenge is the self-discharge. So if you leave your battery sitting for several months, maybe it's not as charged as it was when you left it there. Whereas in the case of chemical energy storage, you have a tank of hydrogen, you have a tank of natural gas, it will still be there for the most part when you come back 3 months later. So there are different places where different technologies make more sense. And that has certainly been my view, very particularly in the case of small distributed power is in fact where fuel cells make sense. And now having them reversible means that you can take advantage of sources that are not aligned with demand. So even whether it's nuclear, whether it's hydro, whether it's wind or solar, there is generally a mismatch between availability and requirement or need. And so that becomes a great way to store them. And in terms of cost, if one has this electrochemical cell that's reversible, that can do both the electricity production and the fuel production for storage, then your costs go down obviously by a factor of 2 because you don't have to have 2 separate systems. The challenges have to come about with designing those electrodes, very similar to the case of batteries, where now we are requiring these catalysts essentially to do 2 different reactions, to work very well in one direction and also work very well in the reverse direction. So similarly, we have to charge up our system by creating hydrogen from the electricity coming in, and then we want to be able to have discharge as quickly as demand arises, which means running in the other direction, consuming that hydrogen to make electricity. We want those catalysts to be good for both directions, and we want to be able to go back and forth. And that's not, as was said, the usual research has not been in this area. It's been very much, fuel cells and batteries. And the idea of electrochemical cells that are reversible but use hydrogen for storage is a little more recent and is gaining some traction. But there's, because it's not been, it's relatively uncharted territory, that means that there's, I would say, a lot of opportunity for making great advances.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Anyone else would like to comment on the prospect of their product being applied to cars?
So we see more synergies rather than competition. We see markets for batteries. We see markets for fuel cells. The advantage of fuel cells is that you decouple storage from power. I mean, in batteries, really, you have to beef up all. So if you need longer range, you have to put more cells. And in the battery world today, the cost is roughly about $200 a kilowatt hour, while for hydrogen, it is only 30 to 50. This is really the range over there. So you'll see significant reduction in the storage cost. However, again, for the fuel cell, you have an overhead, which is your fuel cell itself. So that fuel cell, depending on the range or how much you store, now it may make more sense or less sense. For long-range driving, we see very high prospects for fuel cell vehicles because you can carry and you could multiply your storage at a relatively smaller cost compared to a battery. And for smaller range, we see where battery can compete. Of course, both technologies are developing, and therefore, we do not really rule one or the other. We see really a role for both.
Yeah, my comment on this is that I think it's pretty evident that lithium-ion batteries have a place in the market currently. That's clearly at the high end at the moment, so cost is definitely an issue, as was alluded to. I will note, however, that you can actually go on Amazon right now and find lithium-ion batteries for $100 per kilowatt hour, so the price is coming down. If you look at almost any metric in lithium-ion batteries as a function of time, it's predictably getting better, almost like a Moore's law is occurring as occurred in the microelectronics industry. So I think it's a pretty safe bet that it's going to grow in its penetration in the electric vehicle market. But there's opportunities for a discontinuous improvement, as I alluded to before, on the rate, the charging rate, discharging rate. In fact, Department of Energy has acknowledged this. They have a large funding program right now in addressing the charging time, which is a barrier to the use of electric vehicles compared to conventional internal combustion engines, where we're used to going to the gas pump for 5 minutes and getting another 300 miles. That's not the case today. So that's one opportunity. The other is I talked a lot about the electrolyte-electrode interface and using the electrode and new materials on the electrode to address that issue. The other approach is to address the electrolyte itself, and an emerging topic, primarily in universities and research institutions, but some companies as well are now speaking publicly about replacing the liquid electrolyte with a solid electrolyte. And the solid electrolyte addresses a lot of the safety issues that I alluded to before. It presents some challenges. You tend to slow things down in the solid state compared to the liquid, but I think that's a frontier problem where, again, materials could have a discontinuous effect on what has to date been a largely predictable, a linear improvement in performance.
Mm-hmm. Another dimension that perhaps just to close the discussion on vehicles is how the vehicles are coupled to the grid in the other direction as well. I want to give you the example of my home country of Brazil. It's almost like East Africa in terms of production. Most of it comes from hydro. But it's a single time zone for most of the population, and they tend to use electric showers. So there is a peak in consumption right around 7 p.m. And just to meet that capacity, there is a high cost. So the idea would be that people would have electric cars in the future. They'll charge overnight when it's cheap. They'll sell back to the grid during that period of time when they get home, at least a fraction of what's left in their car battery. That's one example. And of course, then there are questions that you'd have to ask if you're using a different intermediate like hydrogen and other things. And I find it particularly interesting, the reversible process for hydrogen in that sense. So as I get to questions like that, this involves management and operation. And you were talking about microgrids being modular. Perhaps that's the way to go in the future. What are the challenges then with sensing this system, processing information, storing information, actuating this system if the system is built in a modular way?
Yeah, well, I think an electric vehicle is a perfect example of why modularity is needed, right? Because now you have a system where an asset might be there or might not be there, or is arriving or leaving, and then you have to have a flexible enough system that you can still manage those changes, right? That in real time. And in my opinion, everything should be done locally. So and that's the beauty of microgrid, right? You can have a microgrid where you don't have to know what is going on the other side of the city. You just have to know what is going on locally, and then maybe a higher level of control needs to know what's going on in the entire system, but the amount of information that you need to relay upwards is less, right? And you can go even lower to that, and that's why I was talking about building blocks, where you have a building block that you process information there, and you manage everything that you can manage there, and then you just summarize that information for the upper level controller, which in that case will be like a microgrid controller. And then the microgrid controller goes higher and relays the important information to whatever the utility or an aggregator of microgrids needs to know. So you can have this hierarchical structure that process data in a much more efficient way. And that leads to modularity, because if you have something that is coming or leaving, well, you don't have to worry about it while it's not there, right? The car itself has intelligence that will take care of that. When it arrives to a different microgrid, for example, it will be part of that microgrid. You go to a different, it returns, then it's part of the microgrid. So electric vehicles are a disruption for the electric system, and if you don't manage them properly, it's going to be very hard to integrate them. A very simple example is the transformers that are installed in residential neighborhoods are not sized for everybody to have an electric vehicle. So if everybody starts owning more and more electric vehicles, and then they go and plug it at their place, it's not going to work. The transformers won't be able to handle it. So the grid is not built for that if we don't manage it correctly.
I am sure that new businesses will be created around that.
Of course.
So now maybe we could face two questions from the audience. Where is the microphone? Luis, you can speak, yeah.
My name is Luis Amaral. I'm in the engineering school. And I like this idea of the modularity, right? That you can put in different pieces. And actually, you could play to the strengths of each one of the technologies instead of actually trying to make each technology be an all for everything. The question is, to what is the smallest scale that you can go with the modularization? So I can see in a microgrid you can have all of these things, but could I imagine having in my phone something that involves batteries and fuel cells and a way to control it or not? Is there sort of a kind of limit on how small the pieces can be that you could integrate them and take use of the different advantages of the different technologies?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that. And there's a practical and a theoretical answer to that, right? So theoretically, yes, you can have your phone. And I have been in presentations where they say, that the charger for phones, we should make it bidirectional, so that when you plug your phone into the wall, you can support the grid. And one phone doesn't do anything, but if you have millions of phones, they are batteries, and if you aggregate them, then it's not a bad idea. Is it practical? Probably not, because it's very hard to coordinate all these different elements. So that's where, and then you go into cost, right? How much it will cost to make these chargers bidirectional? And probably it's not going to be reasonable. So it's hard to define a limit where, below this it makes sense and above this it doesn't make sense. But depending on the application, for example, for a campus, if you are in the tens or hundreds of kilowatts, then that could be like a single unit, right? You can go lower. Maybe in the future, as power electronics becomes more and more accessible and more efficient, then maybe we'll start seeing going even more granular, which will be interesting. Definitely.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Tucker Cartel. I work with a renewable developer and invested in. My question is regarding flow batteries. Some of the lithium-ion is fast charge, fast discharge. The microgrids, slower charging and slower discharge. Maybe a flow battery might be appropriate. I was wondering what the panel's going to think about that.
Yeah, I would call it in this sort of general realm of electrochemical cells. But the nice thing about a flow battery, similar to a fuel cell, is that that the tank size is separate from the power part, the part that is generating the power for you and needs to be recharged. So that does have benefits. So it makes it very, very similar. I can't really comment on the relative costs yet. Certainly, again, a reversible fuel cell is basically a flow cell with hydrogen and oxygen as being the gases that you flow as opposed to liquids that you flow. So these are all still very much in early stages in terms of, what is the economy of scale, what is the cost system level integration, and how do we put it together in with a microgrid. So I wouldn't say one is better or worse than the other, but I would say those have been under development longer than reversible hydrogen-oxygen cells. So,
Craig.
But the reversible electrolyzer fuel cell, you mentioned natural gas. Am I assuming that that's a solid oxide?
yes, these are high temperature. Yes, I should have mentioned that. And yeah, in contrast to the in contrast to the vehicle fuel cells, which operate closer to ambient temperatures and have a polymer electrolyte. Yes.
Does it bring in combined heat and fluid?
Yes, and so that allows you to have much higher efficiencies. In principle, requires that you have a lot of system integration, but I didn't want to delve into all this detail yet. Yes, but.
So, I think Chris made the great comparison between the East Coast and the West Coast. So your solid oxide fuel cell fits the California model perfectly because you're still using some natural gas, but I'm going to assume your efficiencies because your program were pretty high.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then we can harvest that waste heat and use it in the system like the East Coast is doing with the volume power.
Right. Right. And I've seen a recent analysis for a reversible electrochemical cell, which has some very, optimistic assessments for how much heat recovery you could get, but then the round trip efficiency ends up extremely high if you can do that. But it does require, again, this building the entire system, working very closely with mechanical engineers, the heat recovery, heat storage, so that when you go back and forth between the two, because in fuel cell mode, you have waste heat, electrolysis mode, you need heat to go back in. So you want to store that heat for the electrolysis if you're focused on the round trip efficiency for hydrogen to electricity.
So that begs a question. What about the natural gas? In the system itself, could we get the amorphous carbon separated in that system? Have you thought about that?
So, short answer is, have I deeply thought about it? No. There are ways of using carbon directly in a fuel cell. You, again, have to worry about storing that CO2 and using it, in this recycling, regenerative mode and not allowing the CO2 to go to the atmosphere. So you can, and I actually have a colleague who's spent a little more time thinking about the CO2 part of that, whereas we've spent a little more time just on the hydrogen. But these are also possible. And the storage is, of course, easier if you have methane than if you have hydrogen.
I guess a follow-up question to Amgad is when in talking about hydrogen production, I assume that we were all talking about water hydrolysis. Are there other cost-effective ways to go about it?
So the status quo today is natural gas SMR, steam methane reforming, and roughly 98% of what is produced today is through SMR. But looking into the future and looking at the demand on renewable hydrogen, for example, California demands that if you fuel your fuel cell vehicle, 33% of it will come from a renewable source. So there is a big demand for renewable hydrogen, and looking into the future, and as the previous panel, eventually, really, that vision is really a vision for longer term, not really for this year or next year. And how to decarbonize across sectors, and this is where hydrogen can play a central role.
Let's have the microphone here. Just to give a chance to people in the back part of the room to hear you.
Jack Wadsworth again. I'm curious, two questions. One, have any of you developed systematic ways for tracking the development of outside-the-box technologies? The things that surprise us so often are things that nobody, has thought of or seen. And hydrogen and battery development are things that we're all watching, but is there something else? And even in that category, are there things that are developing that we might be aware of if you were systematically tracking it? And I would ask you specifically about two companies. There's a company called Lynet, L-Y-N-E-T, in Sunnyvale, California, that has developed a technology for separating hydrogen and usable carbon from natural gas at a very low cost. And apparently the carbon that they're developing is like the so-called buckyballs, which can be used for battery technology in some very interesting ways. The other is Bloom Energy, which is a fuel cell that's pretty much off the charts in terms of efficiency increasingly, and it's now pretty much firing every data center in America just because of its reliability. And their costs are coming down because it has a kind of a semiconductor Moore's law, character to it. So really two questions.
Okay, I'm going to step in right away and say that you asked if we track out-of-the-box thinking and ideas. We like to say that we come up with those. We're not simply tracking the rest. Certainly, I think academics and many companies, I think that's the idea, right? But of course, we need to know who the competition is.
Can you keep us informed?
Well, I mean, certainly, yes, I'll leave it at that. Just to comment on Bloom, because I used to be on the West Coast myself, and our campus had a Bloom cell, so big stack. They're very, very quiet about the details of their technology. I would not call them an out-of-the-box company because the components that they use are actually quite standard. What they've done is really, I would say, out-of-the-box financial planning. There was one year where they managed to take something like 90% of all the incentives within the state of California for all the sort of renewable, to encourage renewables on the grid, and they knew exactly where to place their cells to be able to benefit from that. And I think that's great because there needs to be a market in fuel cells so that all this effort that's been going into the research side has a place to be realized in a technological examples. But I would not call them an outside-of-the-box company in terms of their technology.
But I mean, just to follow up on this a little bit more, one way to track sort of more macroscopically what's happening in the research institutions is by looking where the funding is going. And I think the Department of Energy has made some shrewd investments through two major programs. One is their so-called Energy Hub program. There's an Energy Hub at Argonne National Lab, which is focusing on out-of-the-box battery ideas, including flow batteries that we heard about before, including looking at multivalent cations. So lithium is a charge of 1, but there are other elements in the periodic table where we have a charge of 2 or 3, which double or triple the amount of charge that you're storing per cycle. So those hubs are doing that, really exploring a broad portfolio of exotic ideas. The other major program is the so-called Energy Frontier Research Center program, of which many of us at the university are members of, and that's very diversified. So there's of order 30 of those around the country in all aspects of energy, on the supply side and the demand side. And it's funded out of the basic energy sciences portion of Department of Energy, which means not worrying about meeting some target in a year or two, but looking 5-10 years down the road. And I think that those investments at the government level are a good place to look for where those next generation ideas are coming from. The only comment I'll make about Lynet is the fact that they're basically looking at sort of multiple technologies concurrently, getting the hydrogen and the so-called sp2 bonded carbon, which are buckyballs or carbon nanotubes or graphene, means that they're basically getting 2-for-1 type of situation or impacting multiple technologies at once. I think that's probably a wise move in that I don't think in the energy world there's going to be a winner. So if you can impact multiple, that advances the program more rapidly.
All right. A final quick question.
This is just a follow-up for what you were saying. There has been a lot of talk in the last 2 years about major cuts to research in the Department of Energy that trickles down into universities. There's all sorts of things. So what do you see 5 years out? Where are we going? Is the United States going to continue to lead, or is this budget crunch going to hit, and how will that affect things?
Well, I mean, my take on this is that there's been a lot of rhetoric along those lines. And I think the rhetoric is problematic because it creates fear and it influences decision making. But in actual fact, as we all saw last month, the budget was passed, and the agencies that fund basic science, such as the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, did quite well. So it would be great if the rhetoric could be toned down, in my opinion, because it does influence decision making, whether or not the reality reflects that.
All right, so since we'll have the opportunity to continue this discussion over lunch, I will, in the interest of time, stop now with a quick summary of my own at the risk of perhaps misrepresenting what was just said. It appears to me that progress in the deployment of microgrids will depend on development of a combination of solutions which might be influenced by local factors, including the pattern of power demand and weather conditions in the area. Storage will always play a significant role when the sources are intermittent, as the ones we have been discussing here the most. And both batteries and hydrogen are appearing as leading options for storage, each one of them with its own niche and relevant time scale. And as George pointed out, one of the problems, and I think this problem is perhaps even bigger than the issue of just putting together a microgrid, it reflects also on the research and development part, is the issue of lack of standardization, and the solution seems to be quite reasonable, the one of creating modular systems so that people can design their own microgrid and without having to conceive a new design from scratch. I would say that the question of data here, which was not discussed much earlier, is very delicate, not only from the technical perspective, but also from policy and regulation. And I will say that because of my own work on not the microgrid, but the macrogrid, where there are lots of barriers to transferring information from one area to the other. So I would leave things here, and I guess now Eric will have some final words about lunch.